You'll notice he no longer suffers delusions of humanity.
Affirmative.
On this episode, I'm going to undertake the task issued by Red Wolf to descend down into the hole of the Theosophical Society. So I thought I'd take Lone Wolf's approach. The Froud came first. Make sure y'all go subscribe to Red Wolf and to Lone Wolf. The links will be in the description. But the Froud came first. A better pamphlet to start with than The Fraud of the Modern Theosophical Society Exposed, written by Jan Malinsky. So without further ado, I'm not going to keep y'all waiting. I'm not going to talk too much. I'll jump in every once in a while, but we're going to read this and knock this out. So here we go. The Fraud of Modern Theosophy Exposed by Jan Masculine. During a recent controversy in the press upon occultism, I was interviewed upon it by a representative of the Globe. The question of theosophy cropped up during our chat, and I expressed my opinion that Madame Blavatsky's theosophy was the greatest fraud of the present day. The publication of this statement brought the following letter to the editor of the Globe. Sir, if it is true that Mr. Masculine has referred to theosophy as being a fraud and in danger of exposure, he has made a foolish remark. Theosophy is founded on a groundwork too old, too deep, and too subtle to be possible of exposure. Of course, there are two phases of theosophy. The esoteric, which can only be fully realized by intuition, and the exoteric, which of course can be grasped by means of theosophical books, teachings, dogmas, etc. But whichever phase you take, it would be quite out of place to refer to theosophy as being a fraud. Theosophy as a doctrine contains the essence of all religious beliefs. Hence, the man who is going to suggest that all religions are founded on fraud places himself in a very awkward position. Perhaps Mr. Masculine will substantiate his statements from the public platform by material means. Yours, etc. Signed, Walter Firminger. Sir, in reply to Mr. Firminger's letter appearing in your issue of the 27th, allow me to state that during my interview with your representative, I expressed my opinion that Madame Blavatsky's theosophy was the greatest fraud of the present day. That opinion I am prepared to substantiate, having in my possession an overwhelming number of indisputable facts proving that the society was founded solely upon falsehood and fraud.
Froud.
Apart from the statements of Madame Blavatsky and Mrs. Besant, no atom of reliable evidence has ever been adduced to prove the existence of Mora and Kut Humi, the mythical Mahatmas of Tibet, who, it is said, founded the Theosophical Society through the mediumship of Madame Blavatsky and her accomplice or dupe, Colonel Olcott. Let me ask Mr. Firminger whether he can give a single reason why the unproved testimony of Madame Blavatsky and Mrs. Besant should be accepted as truth. I will undertake to supply him with abundant facts conclusively proving that their statements ought not to be relied upon. Yours, etc. Signed, J.N. Masculine. This letter raised a storm about my ears. I was challenged to substantiate my statement, and I promised to do so. The publication of this pamphlet is the fulfillment of that promise. For the benefit of readers who have little or no knowledge of the history of the character of Madame Blavatsky, I have found it necessary to go over ground previously trodden by myself and several others, when dealing with the movement as its inception, and subsequently those exposures checked the progress of the society, and would doubtless have killed it entirely but for the unqualled platform eloquence of Mrs. Besant and the ready pens of the paid scribes of the society. Madame Blavatsky was represented as a persecuted saint, and every artifice was resorted to explain away and gloss over charges of disreputable acts and falsehoods which could not be refuted. Neither Mrs. Besant nor anyone among the wire pullers of the movement has ever attempted to prove that the charges brought against Madame Blavatsky are false. The reason for this is obvious. It is impossible to prove them false. Mrs. Besant contents herself with declaring unimpeachable documentary evidence to be gross forgeries, made maliciously, but she does not produce the slightest proof in support of her statements. Charge of malice cannot be upheld. There is no reason for it and no sign of it in any of the exposures. What has impelled me to undertake this task is an inherent desire to expose imposture, especially when it is carried on under the cloak of religion. I have been told that the Theosophical Society is an unimportant community and unworthy of my attention. But the society, in fact, has become very important during the past few years. It has many thousands of members and hundreds of branches in different parts of the world. Gold has flowed into its coffers to such an extent that the executives have been able to erect new headquarters in London at a cost of £50,000. The society has left even Christian Science far behind, so far as London is concerned. One Sunday morning recently, I attended one of Miss Besant's lectures at a large Queen's Hall. There was not a vacant seat, although hundreds of them were 5 shillings each. The audience was composed chiefly of ladies, and the faces of some of them were a psychological study. When Mrs. Besant made her appearance, they looked upon her with an expression of awe and admiration, as they would have looked at the spook at the spiritual seance. And when the torrents and cataracts of fine words flowed from her lips, the ladies became spellbound. I verily believe that they half expected the Mahatmas would cause her to float round the hall or perform some other miracle to prove their own existence. Indian mysticism has such a fascination for and perniciousness influence over some people that it leads them to accept without question the statements of every exponent of it who professes supernatural power. Everything is possible and should be done to check the spread of this pernicious doctrine of superstition. I trust that this pamphlet will cause the light of common sense to dispel some of the artificial glamour surrounding Indian mysticism. So we see in the preface that the author is on their neck. And I appreciate that. Let's continue. Chapter 1. Madame Blavatsky. There is no religion higher than the truth. This is the motto of the Theosophical Society. No one can question the beauty and sublimity of the phrase, but it can scarcely be considered appropriate, as Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the society and inventor of the motto, rarely spoke the truth. This may be considered too sweeping an assertion, but a perusal of these pages will show that it is not an exaggeration of the facts. In Mr. Sennett's Life of Madame Blavatsky, written from information received firsthand, we learn that she was born in the south of Russia in 1831. Her maiden name was Helena Petrovna Hahn. Little information of her early youth is vouched to us, but at the age of 16 she married General Blavatsky, the date of the marriage being July 7, 1848. Her husband was nearly 70 years of age. She lived with him for only 3 months and fled from him, for good and all, in October of the same year. She went to Tibet to be instructed by the great Mahatmas, Moira and Koot Humi, who had chosen her as the medium through who they would give the world a new religion. No date is given for her entry into Tibet and her 7 years sojourn in that country, but it is stated to have been between the time she left her husband and May 1857. There is no case on record of any other female being admitted to the abode of these Mahatmas and being personally instructed by them, so the young lady must have considered herself highly favored. Not a word is mentioned as to how so young a lady managed to get into Tibet, one of the most inaccessible countries in the world, but we are told that she remained in the country for 7 years. Mr. Sennett tells us that the 7 years is the shortest period for a probationer to serve before being admitted to even the first of the ordeals, which are very severe. I remember, he says, Madame Blavatsky saying that their ordeals had been by earth, air, fire, and water. During her stay in Tibet, she was given access to marvelous subterranean libraries. One was of vast dimensions, and it contained more books than the British Museum would hold. In one of these concealed crypts, she was allowed to peruse the Book of Dizyan. She says it was an archaic manuscript, a collection of palm leaves made impermeable to water, fire, and air by some specific unknown process. It is written in a tongue absent from the nomenclature of languages and dialects which philology is acquainted. She gives an extract from this wonderful book which she was able to translate, although it was an unknown tongue. Fortunately for her, it is found to be a page copied from Rig Veda, with a little alteration in the text. Mr. Sennett tells us that Madame Blavatsky left Tibet with a block of truth, and fully impressed with the magnitude of her mission. She emerged from apprenticeship to duty. That duty was to found the Theosophical Society. The 3 main objects of the society were stated to be: number 1, to put down spiritualism; number 2, to convert materialists; number 3, to prove the existence of the Mahatmas. This is the story concocted by this adventuress in 1875. I shall prove there is not a single word of truth in it. During the whole of the time she said she was in Tibet, she was wandering about Europe leading a very questionable life, at times suspected of being a Russian spy and told that her presence was not required in the country in which she was residing. She was in Paris in 1849 experimenting in hypnotism with a famous old mesmerist who discovered her psychic gifts and was anxious to retain her as a sensitive, but she fled from Paris to escape his influence. She went to London and stayed for some time with a Russian lady at Mivart's Hotel. She says she met her favorite Mahatma, Moria, on the bank of the Serpentine in 1851. Presumably, he came to London to see the Great Exhibition. She visited Greece and Egypt. In Upper Egypt, she says she witnessed the much talked of miracle of Indian jugglers, which was so much exaggerated by Marco Polo and drunken Emperor Jahangir. Her description of the trick differs from any other I have heard, and all the stories of the trick differ materially. I will give Madam's description, which must be taken with several grains of salt. In full sight of a multitude comprising several hundred Europeans and many thousand Egyptians and Africans, the juggler came out on a bare space of ground, leading a small boy stark naked by the hand and carrying a huge roll of tape that might be 12 or 18 inches wide. I have never heard of any tape of such width. After certain ceremonies, he whirled the roll about his head several times and then flung it straight up into the air. Instead of falling back to earth after it had ascended a short distance, it kept on upward, unwinding and unwinding interminably from the stick until it grew to be a mere speck, and finally passed out of sight. The juggler drove the pointed end of the stick into the ground and then beckoned the boy to approach. Pointing upward and talking in a strange jargon, he seemed to be ordering the little fellow to ascend the self-suspended tape, which by this time stood straight and stiff as if it were a board whose end rested against some solid support up in midair. The boy bowed in compliance and began climbing using his hands and feet as little All Right does when climbing Satsuma's balance pole. The boy went higher and higher until he too seemed to pass into the clouds and disappear. The juggler waited 5 or 10 minutes and then, pretending to be impatient, shouted up to his assistant as if to order him down. No answer was heard, and no boy appeared. So finally, as if carried away with rage, the juggler thrust a naked sword into his breech cloth, the only garment upon his person, and climbed up after the boy. Up, and hand over hand, and step by step, he ascended until the straining eyes of the multitude saw him no more. There was a moment's pause, and then a wild shriek came down from the sky, and a bleeding arm, as if freshly cut from the boy's body, fell with a horrid thud on the ground. Then came another, then the 2 legs, one after the other, then the dismembered trunk, and last of all, the ghastly head, every part streaming with gore and covering the ground. So many stories have been told about this trick that I felt sure there must be some foundation for them, possibly a very simple trick, of which travelers had given exaggerated accounts. The very best jugglers of India have been brought to this country. We have been shown the marvelous snake charming, the mango growing, the boy murdered in a basket and brought to life, all of which tricks have been spoken of as though they were miracles, especially so by travelers of the literary turn, who habitually spice their stories to make their books attractive. All these tricks have turned out to be very poor affairs, inferior to conjuring in the penny shows of Europe. I asked an Indian juggler one day if he could perform the Indian rope trick. He replied, "Yes, in India." I said, "Can't you do it in England?" He said, "No, only in India can I do it." He refused to say why he could do it only in India. A few years ago, my partners and I decided that if possible, we would probe this trick to the bottom. We spent a considerable sum in advertising for information from any persons who had witnessed the trick. We also offered to pay £5,000 a year to any juggler who could perform the trick in London as it had been described. A number of people gave us information. Most of them were persons who knew somebody who had seen it. A few told us that they had seen it, but their descriptions differed, and they were uncertain about essential points. At last, we were fortunate in finding a gentleman in London who had seen the trick on several occasions and fortunately also had some knowledge of conjuring. He explained the secret. He had been stationed for some years at one of the frontier military posts, and he had noticed that the troop of Indian jugglers always arrived at the time of day when the sun was in the one position and its rays were so strong that Europeans could not be exposed to them. The audience said our informant occupied the balcony of the bungalow and were sheltered from the sun by an awning. The jugglers brought a coil of what appeared to be a large rope. As they uncoiled it and held it up, it became stiff. It was evidently jointed bamboo with the joints made to lock. It was covered to look like a rope, and it formed a pole about 30 feet long. A diminutive boy, not much longer than an Indian monkey, climbed up to the top of the pole and was out of sight of the audience unless they bent forward and looked beneath the awning, when the sun shone in their eyes and blinded them. As soon as the boy was at the top of the pole and the jugglers made a great shouting, declaring he had vanished, he quickly slid down the pole and fell on the ground behind the juggler who held the rope. Another juggler threw a cloth over the boy and pretended that he was dead. After considerable tom-tomming and incantation, the boy began to move and was eventually restored to life. This account was subsequently confirmed by another gentleman who had evidently witnessed the same jugglers perform the feat. The reader will now see why the trick cannot be performed in this country. The bubble has been pricked, the fate of all modern miracles when properly investigated. It has been said that two gentlemen discovered that the jugglers hypnotized the entire audience and made them believe they had seen the trick performed. But one of the gentlemen had a camera and took snapshots, which revealed the fact that the jugglers stood still and did nothing. This story, however, is pure fiction. It was invented by two American journalists who wished to test the credulity of the public. After this story had been translated into many languages and published all over the world, the authors confessed that they invented it. The confession was largely published through the press, but still the story is repeatedly cropping up as the correct explanation of the great rope trick, an illustration of the truth of the adage, give a lie 12 hours start and the truth will never overtake it. Anyone with the least knowledge of hypnotism could not help seeing that the story was an invention, since it is impossible to hypnotize an entire audience. A few persons at a spiritual seance might be hypnotized, and I am convinced that Home, for example, used hypnotism to a large extent. He usually went around the circle making passes over the sitters. Some accounts of my own tricks have been as much exaggerated in India as those of the Indian tricks described by travelers. Two military officers once called on me at an old Egyptian hall and inquired when I should be performing the trick of cutting off my own head and making it float around the hall. I replied that I had never performed such a feat. "Oh," said they, "a young Indian gentleman whom we met out in India told us that he saw you stand in the middle of the stage, cut off your own head, and make it float all around the hall singing, 'Here comes the boogeyman.'" I at once saw that the young gentleman had become excited with my sensational performance, confused my illusions, and probably exaggerated a little. At one time, I performed an illusion in which I apparently cut off the head of my late colleague, and he walked about with it under his arm and talked to the audience. At that time, also, I was giving a dark seance in which a luminous skeleton appeared. Its head came off and floated over the audience, while my organ, with startling electrical effects, would peal out. Hist, hist, hist. Here comes the boogeyman. It is difficult for anyone not an expert to describe an illusory performance correctly. Even level-headed press reporters, when describing my performances from memory, have often credited me with performing impossibilities. But I am digressing, traveling away from Tibet as Madame Blavatsky did in 1849. So through the first chapter, we're seeing that she's a liar, plagiarist, thief, grand exaggerator. You know, it's not looking good for the so-called founder of the Theosophical Society off the break. Granted, this is a book about her fraud, but you know, I've already read some articles from like the late 1800s about this woman, and they didn't have too good things to say about her. We'll get to those another time, but we're going to go ahead and move on to chapter 2. Chapter 2. Madame Blavatsky and the Miraculous Rope Trick. We hear that Madame Blavatsky had two husbands besides General Blavatsky, one named Metrovich and another named Bettinelli. But it is not explained how, notwithstanding this, she continued to use the name Blavatsky. Colonel Olcott says in the same year, 1851, she was in Deratchi, Tehag, in the plain of Mount Arat. Her husband, he doesn't say which, perhaps a fourth, was vice governor of Erivan and had a bodyguard of 50 Kurd warriors. Madame Blavatsky met Home, the medium, in Paris in 1858, and she says he converted her to spiritualism and that she knew nothing about spiritualism until she met Home. He confirms this story and says in a letter to a friend, "I took no interest in her, excepting a singular impression I had the first time I saw a young gentleman who has ever since been a brother to me. He did not follow my advice. He was at the time her lover, and it was most repulsive to me that in order to attract attention, she pretended to be a medium. My friend still thinks she is mediumistic, but he is also just as fully convinced that she is a cheat. However, we are here confronted with a difficulty. If Madame knew nothing about spiritualism until 1858, how came the Mahatmas to dispute her and to put it down so long before? It is certain that the Madame went from Paris to Russia. Her sister, Madame D. Julahowski, confirms this and says that she gave spiritual seances consisting of messages from spirits by table rapping. Madame was evidently anxious to show off the tricks she had learned from Home, the medium, and she takes the credit of having converted her father to spiritualism. This is the first authentic information we have on Madame Blavatsky knowing anything about spiritualism, but spiritualism entered largely into all her schemes afterwards. It must be borne in mind that there is no record of Madame Blavatsky having mentioned a word to anybody about her journey to Tibet until she started the Theosophical Society in 1875. Subsequently, she discovered that she was bowed out over this story. She had done much of the bowing herself, as liars usually do when they talk much and have not good memories. So she invents an entirely new story. She informs Mr. Sennett that it was in September 1856 that she went into Tibet for the first time. She was smuggled in a suitable disguise, by a solitary shaman, who was her sole protector. She afterwards tells Mr. Sennett that she left Tibet just before the Indian Mutiny broke out. That makes it about 6 months from the time she started to go to Tibet from Kashmir, to climb the most formidable mountains in the world with one solitary shaman. The mountains from Kashmir to Tibet are absolutely impassable in winter. Travelers tell us that in the summer it is necessary to employ a large number of ponies and scores of coolies to convey the necessary baggage for the journey, and then it occupies 5 or 6 weeks. The faithful have said that no doubt that the Mahatmas conveyed her across the mountains miraculously. I cannot, of course, disprove that, but it is strange that Madame should have omitted to mention such an important fact. The absolute proof, however, that Madame Blavatsky was never in Tibet in her life is to be found in her descriptions of the country and its inhabitants. She describes the lamas as holy men and says, "They are miracles in themselves, as they show what a determined will and purity of life and purpose are able to accomplish, and to what degree of pre-natural asceticism and a human body can be subjugated and yet live and reach ripe old age. All of the great explorers of the country tell a very different tale. The manners and customs of the people can be summed up in one word: beastly." Major George Pierre, who was in the country in the early part of this year, 1912, says that 90% of the people are thieves and that immorality is general among them, even among the chief lamas. Madame Blavatsky says that she saw processions of nuns and that some of them possess marvelous psychological powers. There are no nuns in the country. The women are filthy in the extreme and practice polyandry generally. In 1871, we find Madame Blavatsky in Cairo conducting a spiritualistic society, but it did not last a fortnight. At one of her seances, a stuffed glove that she used for a spirit hand was found, with other contrivances, in the back of the cabinet. The enraged audience nearly killed her. She explained this fiasco to Mr. Sennett. "A madman," she says, "tried to shoot me. He was possessed by a vile spook. After the failure of these schemes, Madame was in very low water. She could not pay her debts and was obliged to borrow money." At this period, spiritualism was rife in America. Several mediums were creating a great sensation with materializing seances. Presumably, Madame Blavatsky thought America would be the best field for further exploits in the supernatural. She sailed as a steerage passenger and arrived in New York in the summer of 1874. Sensational reports were appearing in the papers of wonderful phenomena produced by the Eddy brothers. and as soon as she could possibly do so, Madame Blavatsky proceeded to the Chittenden to see the Eddie show, and there she met Colonel Olcott. He had been in the military police during the war and had received the honorary rank of colonel. He was a solicitor by profession and wrote articles for the press. He attended the Eddie show as a representative of the New York Sun. Having politely offered Madame Blavatsky a light for her cigarette, he struck up an acquaintance with her. She fascinated him with her conversation, and they soon became chummy, so much so that he nicknamed her Jack. And in her letters to him, she signed herself Jack. Madame became a constant visitor to the Eddie seances. The colonel innocently, but significantly, remarked that the manifestations became more wonderful after Madame Blavatsky became a visitor, particularly when she held the medium's hand, which the medium preferred to the colonel's. On one occasion, the spirit volunteered to go to the grave of Madame's father and take from the breast of the corpse a buckle of a medal of honor which he had been buried with. When the light was struck, Madame was holding in her hand a curious buckle and gazing upon it in speechless wonder. When she recovered sufficiently to speak, she explained that she recognized the buckle by certain peculiarities, and said it was put upon her dead father's breast with the Medal of Honor. This revolting manifestation created immense excitement and brought crowds to the seances. But alas, the Eddies shared the fate of all professional mediums. They were completely exposed, and they publicly confessed to the fraud. However, there were mediums who produced genuine materializations, and Madame became a frequent visitor of their seances. They were Mr. and Mrs. Holmes, and their manifestations were pronounced genuine by some of the most scientific men of the day, including Robert Dale Owen, who had written in glowing terms about them. The spirit generally materialized was the well-known Katy King, whom Sir William Crookes photographed many times and from whose head he cut locks of hair. This fraud succeeded for some time, but at last it was exposed, and Katy King proved to be Eliza White. She confessed to the fraud and explained how the trick was worked. The shock of the exposure was more than poor Robert Dale Owen could bear. He became insane and for a time was confined in a lunatic asylum. Here was another knockdown blow for Madame Blavatsky, who doubtless had been a confederate of Holmes. Mr. Coleman, a well-known spiritualist, stated it was so, and R. B. Westbrook, LLD, confirmed this statement, and added that in a letter to Mrs. Holmes, Madame had proposed a partnership in the materializing business, with Colonel Olcott as manager, claiming that she had psychologized him so that he did not know his head from his heels. No doubt she had got the colonel fairly in her clutches. Indeed, he has himself stated that he had to support her all the time she was in America. Up to this time, it was obvious that Madame acted the part of the spirit medium, pure and simple, in one sense, but no word about the Mahatmas and the mighty mission she had received to put down spiritualism in 1856.
Well, this lady is garnering quite the bad reputation for herself through both of these chapters we've read so far. And like I said, I'm not going to do too much breakdowns here. We're just going to read it and we put it out for you because I found some more interesting information that will go along with what we're reading here. So it makes you wonder what had to go down for this society to start off with their founder like this, for them to still be around today. It's going to be an interesting journey we take. So join me on the next episode, and we're going to get into the next couple of chapters. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. Stay tuned. In between these readings, I'm going to have article readings from these old newspapers, because I get the nagging suspicion that they have a lot to do with what's going on right now on multiple levels. But we'll get into that next time.
So say good night to the bad guy. Go on.
I am a human being. I exist.
Delusions, Mr. Wordsworth. Delusions.